welcome dreamers. If you enjoy these historical sleep stories, please like, subscribe, and comment below with your country and current time. Now, let's drift back to 1920s Paris, to the quiet shadow of its heroin crisis. The Great War was over. The guns of August had fallen silent, leaving behind a silence that was, for many, more deafening than the artillery barrages. A generation of young men had been shattered, not just in body, but in spirit. They returned to cobblestone streets and familiar facades, but they carried within them a foreign country of terror and loss. They were the gules cassés, the broken faces, men whose visages had been remade by shrapnel and surgery, but also men whose inner landscapes had been irrevocably scarred, and they came back to a Paris that was determined to forget. Paris in the 1920s wanted to be a festival. It was the années folles, the crazy years. It was the city of Hemingway's movable feast, of Fitzgerald's glittering parties, of Josephine Baker's banana dance, and the revolutionary jazz that spilled out of the cellars of Montmartre. It was the sound of typewriters clacking in left bank cafes, where artists and writers like Picasso, Joyce, and Man Ray were reassembling the very idea of art and literature. The city was a magnet for American expatriates, fleeing the puritanism of prohibition, arriving with strong dollars and a thirst for life. They saw only the brilliant surface, the champagne, the art, the freedom. They wrote about the light on the Seine, the taste of fresh oysters, the thrill of intellectual and sexual liberation. But beneath this dazzling surface, in the same arrondissements that hosted this glorious carnival, another, quieter story was unfolding. It was a story of a different kind of hunger, a different kind of ache. The medical profession, having witnessed the horrors of the war, had come to rely heavily on new, powerful analgesics. Morphine, a derivative of opium, had been a godsend in field hospitals. It was the difference between screaming oneself hoarse and a few hours of blessed, numb respite. Heroin, first synthesized by the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in the late 19th century, was initially hailed as a non-addictive miracle cure for morphine addiction and respiratory illnesses. It was, for a brief, naive moment, considered a safe hero. And so, after the war, these substances were readily available. They were in pharmacy cabinets, in doctors' bags. They were the chemical answer to a pain that had no other language. For the physically wounded, they were a continuation of necessary treatment. For the psychologically scarred, they became a necessity of a different kind. The war had taught an entire generation that the world was a place of unbearable, random violence. Heroin offered a different lesson. It promised a world where nothing mattered at all. It didn't just kill pain, it killed feeling. It replaced the churning anxiety of a shell-shocked veteran with a warm, heavy blanket of indifference. It was an internal peace treaty, signed with a needle and a spoon. The city itself was the perfect incubator. Paris was a hub of international trade and shipping. Its ports, its connections to the colonies, and the general chaos of post-war Europe created gaps in the fabric of law and order. Opium, the raw ingredient, could be smuggled from the poppy fields of Turkey or Southeast Asia with relative ease. Crude laboratories, often in unassuming apartments in the 10th or 18th arrondissements, could refine it into the more potent hydrochloride salt that was heroin. The distribution networks were already in place, run by a burgeoning underworld of Corsican and French gangsters who saw the immense profit in selling peace of mind to the desperate. The users were not yet the desperate figures we might imagine from later depictions. They were, at first, often from the very heart of the vibrant city. They were artists, musicians, writers. They were the very people creating the myth of the crazy years. For them, heroin was not an escape from poverty, but from consciousness itself. It was a tool for breaking down perceptual barriers, for seeing the world in a new way. They whispered about its ability to dissolve the ego, to grant access to a purer form of creativity. It was a romantic, dangerous idea that one could purchase a glimpse of the sublime from a small glassine packet. They were seekers, and the drug was their dark sacrament. But the sacrament always demanded a higher price. The initial euphoria, the rush, was always followed by a slow, draining descent. The body, cunning in its own survival, would adapt. It would demand more of the substance just to feel normal, to stave off the crushing weight of withdrawal. The creative seeker would find that the well of inspiration had run dry, replaced by a single, all-consuming need. The veteran seeking peace would find himself in a new kind of war, a daily battle for a dose. The glittering cafes began to hold two separate realities: the lively debates at one table and the sunken, sallow face of a man in the corner, his mind already miles away, chasing the dragon in the recesses of his own mind. The authorities, of course, were aware, but their understanding was primitive, clouded by stigma and a lack of scientific knowledge. Addiction was often seen as a moral failing, a weakness of the will, a vice of the decadent or the criminal. Police efforts were fragmented, focused on arresting the small-time user or the street-level dealer, missing the larger, more sophisticated networks. Doctors were often complicit, some out of genuine ignorance, some out of a desire to help their suffering patients, and a few out of simple greed, writing prescriptions with a liberality that fed the epidemic. The line between medicine and poison, between healer and dealer, was dangerously blurred. So, as the jazz played on in the basements of Le Boeuf sur la Toit, as the flappers danced the Charleston, and as Hemingway wrote of the sun also rising, a parallel city was taking shape. It was a city of quiet transactions in shadowy courtyards. It was a city of shared, knowing glances between hollow-eyed men and women. It was a city where the most sought-after commodity was not art or love or fame, but simple, chemical oblivion. The stage was set. The players were in place. The crisis was no longer looming. It was already seeping into the very stones of Paris, a slow, persistent tide moving just underneath the dazzling, frantic energy of the crazy years. It was a whisper growing steadily into a scream that nobody yet knew how to hear. And as we leave this part of the story, you can feel the weight of this gathering quiet, this slow descent. Just let it be a story, a history that happened long ago and far away. Allow your breathing to match the slow, even rhythm of this tale. And when you are ready, we will gently move to the next part, deeper into the quiet heart of the city. For now, just rest, just listen, and let go. Part 2 of 10. The human body is a map of its own experiences. And for those drawn into the orbit of heroin in 1920s Paris, the landscape was being redrawn by a chemical cartographer. The initial encounter was often described not as a vice, but as a revelation. Imagine, if you will, a young poet, let's call him Jean Paul, sitting in a cramped room overlooking the rooftops of Montparnasse. He has survived the trenches, but his mind has not. The sound of a backfiring automobile sends him diving for cover under a cafe table. The smell of certain foods can trigger a nausea that is more memory than illness. He is haunted, a ghost in his own life. A friend, a fellow veteran with the same hollow look in his eyes, offers him a solution. It is not in a bottle of wine or a glass of absinthe, those traditional tools of the French artist. It is a fine white powder. It will help you forget, the friend says, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. It will give you peace. The ritual is simple, almost sacred. The powder is carefully tapped onto a piece of folded foil. A match is struck. The flame licks the underside, and a thin, brownish trail of smoke begins to rise, coiling in the air like a languid serpent. Jean Paul leans over, a straw or a rolled-up banknote in his hand, and he inhales. They call it chasing the dragon, a poetic name for a physiological event. The effect is not immediate, but it is swift. First, a faint metallic taste at the back of the throat. Then a warmth begins in the pit of the stomach. A warmth that feels profoundly safe, profoundly good. It spreads outwards through the limbs to the very tips of the fingers and toes. The constant, gnawing anxiety that has been his companion for years simply melts. It doesn't retreat, it dissolves. The sharp edges of the world become soft, blurred. The cacophony of his memories fades to a distant, unimportant murmur. He feels a wave of euphoria, a sense that all is right, that he is exactly where he is meant to be, that he is, for the first time in a very long time, whole. This is the rush, the promise fulfilled. For Jean-Paul, it feels less like taking a drug and more like coming home. This is the siren's song. This is the moment of seduction. The brain's own delicate system of rewards, its natural production of endorphins that make us feel pleasure from a good meal, a lover's touch, or a beautiful sunset, is suddenly and overwhelmingly hijacked. Heroin, once it crosses the blood-brain barrier, is converted back into morphine, which binds to the brain's opioid receptors. It does so with a force and efficiency that the body's own chemistry cannot match. It is like comparing a candle to a searchlight. The brain is flooded with dopamine, the neurotransmitter of pleasure, creating an intense, artificial peak of well-being. But the body is a system of balance, of homeostasis. It cannot tolerate this state of artificial bliss for long. In its brilliant, stubborn drive to survive, it fights back. It begins to downregulate its own production of endorphins. Why should it bother when this external chemical does the job so much more powerfully? It also reduces the number of available opioid receptors. The searchlight is so bright that the body closes some of the windows to protect itself. This is the beginning of the trap. The user, like Jean-Paul, chases that initial feeling of homecoming, that first perfect rush. But it is a memory that can never be fully recaptured. The next time he chases the dragon, his brain is already different. It has fewer receptors and is producing fewer of its own feel-good chemicals. The same dose produces a lesser effect. So he must use more, and then more again. This is tolerance, the slow, insidious escalation of the dose to achieve the same level of feeling, or more accurately, the same level of not feeling the pain of existence. And then comes the other side of the bargain, dependence. The body now incorporates the drug into its baseline state of normalcy. The heroin is no longer a guest. It has become the landlord. It dictates the terms. If the drug is withheld, the body, having abandoned its own natural regulatory systems, goes into a state of violent rebellion. This is withdrawal. It is the exact opposite of the warm, heavy blanket of the high. For Jean-Paul, if he cannot get his dose, the peace shatters. It begins with restlessness, a deep ache in the bones, as if the marrow itself is freezing. Then comes the running of the nose, the watering of the eyes, symptoms mimicking a severe flu. But it quickly deepens into something far more terrifying. Agonizing muscle and bone pain, severe cramping in the stomach and legs, diarrhea and vomiting. The body, which was once warmed, is now racked with waves of hot and cold flashes. The cold turkey that gives the process its name. The skin crawls, feeling as if insects are burrowing beneath it. Sleep is impossible, replaced by a twitching, sweating, wide-awake nightmare. This is not merely feeling sick. This is the body screaming in protest at the absence of the chemical it has been forced to rely on. The psychological torment is just as severe. A deep, profound depression, anxiety, and an all-consuming craving for the one thing that can make it stop. The fear of withdrawal becomes a more powerful motivator than the desire for the high itself. The drug is no longer about seeking pleasure. It is about avoiding a pain that is worse than any the original trauma could inflict. So, Jean Paul's life begins to reorient itself around this single, central need. The poetry that once mattered becomes a distant memory. His friends, unless they are part of this world, fall away. His money, his possessions, all are funneled towards the next dose. His map of Paris is redrawn not by monuments and cafes, but by the locations of his dealers, the safe places to use, the pharmacies with lax oversight. He is no longer a poet haunted by war. He is a biological machine with one imperative: to feed the need. The quiet crisis was, at its core, a biological one, a silent, desperate rewiring of the human soul, one dose at a time, in the beautiful, broken heart of Paris. A slow, chemical sigh in a city that was determined to keep dancing. Paris, in its desperate hunger for joy, became the perfect host for this quiet epidemic. The city was a central artery of global trade, its ports and railways bustling with goods and people. Amidst the legal cargo, other shipments slipped through. Raw opium from the poppy fields of Turkey and Southeast Asia, discreetly unloaded and transported to clandestine laboratories. These labs were not the industrial complexes of a later era. They were hidden in plain sight, in the cramped, nondescript apartments of the 10th or 18th arrondissements. Here, in back rooms filled with the sharp, chemical smell of acetic anhydride, the raw opium was cooked and transformed into its more potent, crystalline cousin, heroin hydrochloride. The process was dangerous and imprecise, but the profits were immense. The distribution was handled by a growing, organized underworld. Corsican and French gangs, seeing the opportunity, established sophisticated networks. They were not the brash, violent mobsters of American lore, but often quieter, more calculating figures. They understood that their best weapon was corruption, greasing the palms of customs officials, police officers, and dockworkers. The line between the law and the lawless became intentionally blurred. A policeman walking his beat might look the other way for a monthly envelope of cash. A pharmacist might supplement his income by selling prepackaged syringes, or even the drug itself with a wink and a coded phrase. The users, at first, were not the desperate outcasts of society. They were often from the city's vibrant core. Artists, musicians, and writers, the very architects of the crazy years, saw in heroin not an escape from poverty, but from the confines of the self. It was rumored to open doors of perception, to dissolve the ego and grant access to a purer, more profound creativity. In the smoky backrooms of jazz clubs like Le Boeuf sur la Toit, it was passed around like a sacred offering, a key to a higher plane of existence. It was a romantic, fatal misconception, the belief that one could purchase enlightenment in a small white powder. But the body's chemistry is indifferent to romance. The initial euphoria, the warm, heavy blanket that smothered all anxiety, was always followed by a slow, draining descent, tolerance built with cruel efficiency. The dose that brought bliss one week would barely stave off sickness the next. The creative seeker soon found his inspiration replaced by a single, all-consuming need. The artist who sought to break down barriers found himself trapped in a cage of his own making, his world shrinking to the size of a single, daily ritual. The pursuit of the next dose, the city so bright and loud on its surface, now held this quieter, parallel existence. A transaction in a shadowy courtyard, a shared, knowing glance between two hollow-eyed men on a park bench. The frantic, energetic dance of the Anais Falls was accompanied by a slow, mournful waltz of addiction. A dance that was steadily pulling more and more souls into its rhythm, a quiet, relentless pull beneath the glittering surface of the city of light. And so, the dance continued, its steps leading ever inward into the private sanctuaries of the mind that had become prisons. Let's return to our poet, Jean-Paul, for a moment. The room in Montparnasse, once a place of scribbled verses and lofty dreams, was now a cell defined by a single, relentless need. The books gathered dust, the view of the rooftops no longer inspired metaphors of freedom, but only observations of which chimneys offered the best cover for a quick, discreet transaction. His days were no longer measured by the sun or the chiming of church bells, but by the ebb and flow of the substance in his blood. His life contracted into a brutal biological cycle. The frantic planning for the next dose, the anxious journey to acquire it, the fleeting, diminishing ritual of the high, and the slow, dawning dread of the coming withdrawal. His world, which had once encompassed the entire city of light, now consisted of a few city blocks from his room to his dealer's doorstep and back again. This was the great, quiet theft of the crisis. It wasn't just stealing health or money. It was stealing a person's future, their connections, their very self. Jean Paul's friendships with other artists frayed and snapped. They spoke a different language now, one of art and ideas, while his thoughts were reduced to a primitive, chemical vocabulary. He borrowed money, sold his books, then his father's watch, each transaction stripping away another layer of his past identity. The shame was a constant, low hum beneath the anxiety, a feeling that he was becoming a ghost in his own life, watching a stranger inhabit his body. This isolation was not unique to him. All across Paris, in attics and rented rooms, similar private collapses were underway. The city's vibrant social fabric was being subtly picked apart, thread by thread, by thousands of solitary struggles. The brotherhood of users was a myth born of necessity, not camaraderie. Connections were transactional, based on the shared knowledge of where to find relief, but they were fraught with paranoia and competition. A fellow user was as much a potential rival for a limited supply as they were a companion in misery. And through it all, the public face of Paris carried on. The laughter from the cafes still spilled into the streets. The jazz bands still played. The city's renowned intellectual life continued its passionate debates. But for Jean Paul and those like him, it was all happening on the other side of a thick, soundproof glass. He could see the movement and the color, but he could no longer hear the music or feel the warmth. He was a spectator to a feast he could no longer taste, trapped in a silent, shrinking world of his own, a world whose borders were defined by the length of a syringe and the depth of his need, a quiet, desperate island in the roaring river of the city. Let the image of that separation comfort you now. The feeling of being safe on the shore, watching the distant, silent struggles of others far out at sea. Their storms cannot reach you here, in this quiet space. Your world is warm and safe and whole. Just let the story be a soft murmur, a tale of a past that has long since settled into dust. And you are here, in the peaceful present, breathing slowly, drifting. And as these private worlds shrank, a public response began, slowly and clumsily, to take shape. The authorities, the police, the medical establishment, the government, were like distant spectators to a fire they could not quite comprehend. They saw the smoke, the occasional flare of chaos, but the nature of the flames eluded them. The police, trained to deal with crime of action, theft, violence, public disorder, found themselves facing a crime of being, a crime of need. Their methods were blunt instruments against this subtle epidemic. They would sweep through the courtyards of Pigalle or the alleys behind the Gare du Nord, making arrests. But they were often catching the smallest fish, the desperate user, the low-level courier, the street corner dealer, who was often just another user himself, selling to feed his own habit. These arrests did nothing to dam the river of supply. They were merely scooping a few cups of water from a flooding stream. The real sources, the importers and the chemists, remained insulated by layers of intermediaries and a web of corruption. The medical profession was caught in a painful duality. Many doctors, especially older ones, still viewed addiction through a moral lens. It was a vice, a failure of character, a sin of the will. Their prescriptions were often judgment and cold turkey abstinence. A brutal and often futile prescription that ignored the fundamental biological rewrite the drug had performed. They saw the wreckage in their clinics, the malnutrition, the infections from dirty needles, the profound despair, but lacked the tools to understand it as a disease. Yet, a new, more compassionate understanding was beginning to flicker at the edges of the establishment. A younger generation of doctors, some of whom had served in the war and witnessed the birth of this trauma, began to see the user not as a criminal, but as a patient. They observed the universal symptoms of withdrawal, the identical physiological collapse in the artist and the laborer, and started to frame it as a medical condition. They experimented cautiously with gradual reduction methods, with substitutes like codeine. They argued in medical journals for treatment, not punishment. But theirs were still quiet voices, struggling to be heard over the louder, more certain calls for law and order. Meanwhile, in the press, the story was often sensationalized. Newspapers wrote lurid accounts of den of vice and moral decay, painting the users as monstrous figures of decadence. This public narrative deepened the stigma, driving those who suffered further into the shadows, afraid to seek help for fear of shame and legal repercussions. The crisis was thus compounded by a crisis of understanding. A wall of fear, judgment, and ignorance was being built between the suffering and those who held the power to help. So the city remained divided, not just between the rich and the poor, but between the public celebration and the private hell, between the punishing hand of the law and the healing potential of medicine, between the roaring crowd and the isolated individual, shivering in a room, waiting for the dragon's fleeting, deceptive warmth. A city of light, yes, but also a city of deep, confusing shadows, where the right path forward was yet to be found. And within those deep, confusing shadows, the ecosystem of the crisis evolved, creating its own peculiar economy, its own rules, and its own devastating toll on the human body. The pursuit of the drug was not just a psychological compulsion. It was a full-time, punishing occupation that left a trail of physical ruin. The financial cost was staggering. A habit that began as a few francs for a weekend's escape could swiftly balloon into a daily expense equivalent to a skilled worker's wage. To sustain it, users embarked on a slow, systematic liquidation of their lives. Jean-Paul had started with selling his books of poetry, then his spare coat. Soon, he was pawning his furniture, the typewriter that was once his most prized possession. The material world dissolved around him, converted into the single, transient currency of the next dose. For those without possessions to sell, the path led to crime, petty theft, shoplifting, prostitution, fraud. The quiet crisis thus fueled a secondary wave of street-level criminality, as desperate individuals were forced to prey upon the very society they were retreating from. But the financial drain was often the least of the physical devastation. The methods of consumption carved their own map of damage onto the body. Chasing the dragon by inhaling the vapors could lead to chronic bronchitis and damage to the lungs and brain. For those who graduated to the needle, the consequences were more immediate and brutal. The syringes of the 1920s were often not sterile, single-use instruments. They were reusable glass and metal contraptions, sometimes shared among a group. The concept of sterilization was poorly understood or ignored in the frantic need for relief. Water from a puddle or a public fountain was often used to mix the solution. The result was a cascade of infections. Abscesses, painful, swollen collections of pus would form at injection sites, marking the skin with ugly, permanent scars. Bacterial infections could enter the bloodstream, causing septicemia, or settle in the heart valves, leading to an often fatal condition called bacterial endocarditis. And then there was the contamination of the drug itself. The heroin that circulated on the street was far from pure. It was cut or diluted by dealers at multiple stages to maximize profits. Quinine, a malaria medication that produced a tingling sensation, was a common additive. So were starch, powdered milk, talcum powder, or even more toxic substances like strychnine. When these unknown mixtures were injected directly into the bloodstream, they could cause allergic reactions, block small blood vessels, and damage organs. The user never knew precisely what poison they were introducing into their body. They only knew it was the price of temporary peace. The body, thus besieged, began to systematically fail. Malnutrition was rampant, as the drug suppressed appetite, and the need for food was forever secondary to the need for the drug. The user's physique would wither, the skin taking on a grayish, sallow hue. Teeth would rot from neglect and the acidic byproducts of the drug. The constant cycle of intoxication and withdrawal was a tremendous strain on the heart and nervous system for Jean Paul, staring into the smudged mirror in his room. The face looking back was a ghost of the young man who had returned from the war. The light in his eyes had been replaced by a flat, distant gaze. The pupils often pinpricks, or in withdrawal, painfully wide. His hands, once steady enough to write, now often trembled. His body was no longer a temple or even a home. It was a battleground, and it was losing the war day by painful day, dose by diminishing dose. It was a slow, internal collapse, hidden beneath a shabby coat, a silent scream in the bustling heart of Paris. As the individual bodies succumbed to their private ruin, the crisis began to seep into the very architecture of the city's society, leaving its subtle, corrosive mark on families, on art, and on the collective soul of Paris. It was no longer a collection of isolated tragedies, but a social current, pulling others into its undertow. The families of users like Jean Paul found themselves trapped in a different kind of helplessness. At first, there was confusion, a missed family dinner, a change in mood, a strange new set of friends. Then came the suspicion, the discovery of a hidden syringe or a missing heirloom, and the devastating confirmation. What followed was a painful cycle of confrontation, pleas, promises, and relapse. Families, armed only with love and fear, tried to become doctors, jailers, and saviors, roles for which they were utterly unequipped. They would try locking the user in their room, only to find them escaped through a window hours later. They would plead with doctors who offered little beyond moralistic advice. They would pay off debts to dealers, unknowingly financing the next round of the very poison they sought to defeat. The shame was a heavy cloak they too were forced to wear, leading them to hide the problem from friends and neighbors, further isolating themselves in a prison of silence. The home, a supposed sanctuary, became a place of constant anxiety, of whispered arguments, and of watching a loved one slowly disappear before their eyes. In the artistic circles that had initially romanticized the drug, a grim disillusionment was setting in. The promised creative zenith never arrived. Instead, it was a cliff. Talents atrophied. The great novel was never finished. The revolutionary painting remained a single, brilliant sketch, followed by years of empty canvases. The music fell silent. The cafes and salons began to notice the absences, the vibrant young poet who no longer appeared, the brilliant pianist whose hands were now too unsteady to play. The drug, marketed as a key to a higher reality, was proving to be only a lock, sealing its users away from the very world that had inspired them. And for the city itself, a certain innocence was being lost. The Anais Falls, the crazy years, began to reveal a more sinister side to its madness. The relentless pursuit of pleasure and the breaking of old boundaries now had a visible, grim consequence. The shadow of the syringe fell across the glamorous posters and the sparkling champagne. The crisis was a silent counter-narrative to the era's myth of carefree liberation, a reminder that some doors, once opened, could not be closed, and some freedoms came with a price that could consume a life. Paris continued to turn, its metabolism too vast to be halted by this slow-burning sickness. But in the worried eyes of a mother waiting by a window, in the unfinished masterpiece, in the empty chair at the cafe, the human cost was being quietly tallied. The city of light was learning, in the most painful way, that some of the darkest shadows are cast not by a lack of light, but by something standing directly in its path, blocking the way forward. And so, the authorities, pressured by a growing public unease that could no longer be completely ignored, began to shift their tactics. The initial, scattered arrests of users and street dealers had proven as effective as trying to dam a river with sand. Now, a new, more targeted approach was tentatively attempted, one aimed at the source. The police began their hunt for the narco-traffickers, a word that was just beginning to whisper through the corridors of the prefecture. This was a different kind of police work. It required patience, infiltration, and a deep understanding of the shadow economy that had blossomed in the city's underbelly. Plainclothes officers began to frequent the same bars and cafes known to be hubs for the illicit trade. They attempted to follow the chains of supply backward, from the user to the dealer, from the dealer to the distributor, and hopefully to the elusive importer or chemist. But they were fighting a hydra. The networks were fluid and decentralized. A distributor arrested in Montmartre would be replaced within days by another, often more cautious and violent. The Corsican gangs, in particular, were ruthlessly efficient. They operated on a code of silence, omerta, that was as solid as the stone of the city's buildings. Intimidation was their tool. A witness who might have spoken to the police would often reconsider after a brutal warning, or simply disappear. Furthermore, the very infrastructure of the city worked against the law. The Warren-like streets of neighborhoods like Belleville, or the labyrinthine courtyards of the Marais, provided perfect cover for quick getaways and hidden laboratories. The constant flow of people and goods through the Gare de l'Est and Gare du Nord made it nearly impossible to monitor every shipment. The police would stage a triumphant raid on a laboratory in a Pigalle apartment, seizing a few kilos of raw opium and some primitive glassware, only to read in a report the following week that the price and purity of heroin on the street remained unchanged. They were swatting at the leaves of a deeply rooted tree. This law enforcement offensive, while well-intentioned, often had the perverse effect of making the crisis more dangerous for the user. As the heat increased on the suppliers, the product became more diluted and expensive. The risk premium was passed directly down the chain to the Jean Pauls of the city, who now had to pay more for a weaker, more adulterated substance, pushing them further into destitution and desperation. The crackdowns also pushed the trade deeper into the shadows, making it more volatile and isolating the users even further from any potential help. It was a frustrating, demoralizing battle. The police, trained for a world of clear criminals and visible crimes, found themselves in a war of whispers and shadows against an enemy that was not a man, but a market, not a gang, but a demand. They could arrest the players, but they couldn't arrest the game. And the game, fueled by a profound and widespread human pain, continued, its rules rewritten daily in the secret meeting places of a city that was learning, for the first time, the true, intractable nature of a modern drug epidemic. And as the decade wore on, the first faint signs of a shift began to appear, not from the might of the law, but from the slow, grinding exhaustion of the crisis itself. The initial wave, which had crested with such silent force, began to recede, leaving a changed landscape in its wake. The story of the heroin crisis in Paris was not ending with a dramatic victory, but with a slow, complicated, and often tragic fading. Some users, like Jean Paul, simply vanished. They succumbed to an overdose from an unpredictably pure batch, or to a systemic infection that their weakened bodies could no longer fight. They died in hospital wards listed under vague diagnoses, or in their rooms, undiscovered for days. Their passing was a quiet statistic, a closed file, a name crossed off a list no official was actually keeping. For them, the long, internal war was over. Others found a different, more protracted form of escape. Their bodies, after years of abuse, could no longer achieve the same heights, nor could they tolerate the devastating lows. The habit became a miserable maintenance program, a daily dose just to function, to keep the sickness at bay. The pursuit of euphoria was a forgotten dream, replaced by the grim reality of managing a chronic condition. They were the living ghosts, haunting the edges of the city, their addiction now a dull, permanent ache rather than a sharp, compelling need. The criminal networks, ever adaptable, also began to shift. The intense police scrutiny, while not eliminating the trade, had made heroin a riskier enterprise. Some gangs pivoted to other, less policed commodities, illicit alcohol, tobacco, or the burgeoning trade in new synthetic drugs. The heroin market did not disappear, but it contracted, becoming a more niche, hardened enterprise, losing its brief, tragic romance, and becoming simply a sordid business. A crucial, albeit slow, change was also occurring in the public and medical consciousness. The sheer scale of the human wreckage made it impossible to sustain the simple narrative of moral failure. The sight of war veterans, hollowed out by the very substances that had once been their salvation, challenged the public's judgment. The persistent advocacy of progressive doctors began to bear small, fragile fruits. The concept of addiction as a medical disease, a pathology to be treated rather than a sin to be punished, slowly gained ground. Small, experimental clinics began to appear, offering not a cure, but a refuge and an attempt at managed withdrawal. A first, hesitant step toward a public health approach by the time the 1930s dawned, with their own gathering clouds of economic despair and political turmoil. The heroin crisis of the 1920s had lost its specific, sharp outline. It had bled into the larger tapestry of urban suffering. The city, in its resilient way, had absorbed the shock. The Anna's falls were definitively over, and with them faded the particular set of conditions that had allowed this crisis to flourish. The party had ended, and the hangover had become just one more part of the city's complex, enduring pain. The crisis left no monuments. There were no plaques for the lost poets or the broken soldiers. Its legacy was quieter, a deeper, more cautious understanding of the power of pharmaceuticals, a nascent framework for thinking about addiction, and a lingering memory of a time when the pursuit of light had cast such long, intricate, and personal shadows. And so the story finds its end, not with a grand conclusion, but with a slow, quiet sigh. The crisis faded, absorbed into the timeless flow of the Seine, its lessons learned in the hardest way possible. The echoes of those long ago struggles have long since stilled. The frantic whispers in the courtyards have fallen silent. The pain has softened into history, a distant, hazy dream. Now, let the last of those echoes lull you to sleep. Release the story. Let the images of old Paris blur and dissolve into the peaceful darkness behind your eyes. There is no more past here, only the calm, steady rhythm of your breath and the deep, comforting silence of the night. And as this story concludes, let its end be a release, a gentle letting go of that old, faded pain. Feel the weight of that history lifting from you, dissolving into the air of your quiet room. It is over now, a tale told, a memory settled. All that remains is your breath, steady and calm, and the deep, welcoming peace of the night, holding you safe, allowing you to drift away into a soft and dreamless sleep. Good night,